go.
Oh my god! This is just like my childhood! Ah!
Ever wondered why you feel nostalgic? Well, basically, the main point of nostalgia is that it combines your memory with your reward system in your brain. So basically, whatever we identify as nostalgic processes, which are like the creation and reception of dopamine in the brain, they're both affected. They're affected by some factors such as emotional and emotional significance, as well as time passed from like when you first experienced that memory. So like a memory from your childhood would obviously create more dopamine than a memory from like 2 weeks ago if it was a good memory, and if it was very significant to you, you would get more nostalgic. And basically, the hippocampus and the ventral striatum are the parts of the brain that undergo these processes the most heavily. So if you look at these pictures on the bottom, the hippocampus is the one on the left, and then the ventral striatum is the one on the right. And then the picture in the middle, the blue regions, show you where dopamine is received. So if dopamine is received in the ventral striatum, while dopamine is created and it's also received in the hippocampus, and it's created in other parts of the brain. So these would constitute nostalgic processes. So basically, the chemical structure of dopamine, it's obviously polar. It has the two hydroxyl regions and then the NH2 region, so the vector quantities don't cancel out. And it has very strong intermolecular forces due to these hydroxyl regions, because hydrogen bonding is shown. So that would give it a very high melting point of 128 degrees Celsius, which compared to water, which is 0 degrees Celsius. And then its molecular geometry, the carbons that are all bonded together, they're all trigonal planar because they have three bonding domains, the one double bond to another carbon, and then a single bond to another carbon, and then another single bond to either hydroxyl group or an NH2 region. And due to these high intermolecular forces, dopamine shows a very low vapor pressure of 1.6 times 10 to the negative 5 millimeters of mercury. And this is important because in vapor pressure, basically, since it has very high intermolecular forces, it's hard for the molecules to break apart and become vapor. So this shows the very low vapor pressure, and it's much higher than water. It's much lower than water's vapor pressure. So dopamine is received in the brain through the 5 main dopamine receptors. So basically, the first dopamine receptor controls sleep and impulse control, and the first receptor is mainly found in the brain, heart, and kidneys. The second dopamine receptor deals with memory and controls your blood pressure, and is found in the vascular kidney. The third one controls your emotions and endocrine functions. The fourth, D4, controls your cognitive function. It's the least common in the central nervous system. And then D5 controls pain processes.
See, this is good. Like, I don't actually have to act.
Oh my god. Is that Super Mario Bros?
Yeah,
Oh my god, can I get in on this?
of course.
Oh my god, this brings back so many childhood memories.
Taste and scent are actually one of our most effective triggers of past memory. Throughout history and evolution and in several cultures, our holidays consist of people gathering around an abundance of food or a feast. So it's not very surprising that we tend to associate foods with strong memories, either sad or happy. So taste on its own is actually a rather muted sense. Our taste buds can distinguish flavors, but most of what we perceive as flavor comes from its scent. And the way we perceive scents has a lot to do with something called the limbic system. So the limbic system is part of the brain that is responsible for our emotions. In the limbic system is the hippocampus, which is specifically responsible for short and long-term memory. Research shows that when the body receives smells or olfactory cues, activity in the hippocampus is triggered. What actually happens is odorant molecules, or here it's aromatic substances, they travel to the olfactory bulb, which is a structure in our forebrain, where a sensor then processes information through something called transduction, which is the converting of stimuli from one form to another. And in this case, it's where an odor is converted to a series of electric pulses. The hippocampus is also linked to hormones in the digestive system that can affect behavior. When food is being digested, the introduced bacteria interact with microbes in your digestive tract and increase production of neurotransmitters and hormones like serotonin. So, within the nasal cavity are olfactory receptor cells with proteins along their surface to allow them to bind to odorant molecules. Now, these proteins will function by binding to an odorant molecule through a series of non-covalent bonds, such as hydrogen bonds, ionic forces, and van der Waals attractions, which some examples of which are shown here and here. These attractions between molecules are known as intermolecular forces and are different from the forces that hold atoms or ions together, which are intramolecular forces. Intramolecular interactions are usually much stronger because they involve the transferring or sharing of fully charged ions. In comparison, intermolecular forces are much weaker. There's no transfer or sharing of electrons, and ions will generally exhibit partial or temporary charges, so the electrostatic interactions are smaller and weaker overall. Van der Waals attractions are particularly weak as they involve molecules which on their own do not exhibit attractive forces. They do not have dipole moments until another molecule in close proximity induces a temporary dipole. So because these individual non-covalent bonds are weak, a lot of bonds are required for the odorant to properly bind to the protein. The protein must be shaped a certain way as to allow for the greatest number of these bonds to that specific odorant molecule, and this is why we have different tastes and smells. The molecules responsible for certain odors, which this graph will show a few of them, they're composed of different elements and are therefore shaped quite differently. The different proteins that have to account for the shapes of these molecules are why we can differentiate between scents. So after the odorant has binded to a receptor cell, which can be seen here, a chemical reaction is activated, resulting in electric signals that axons or nerve fibers in the nasal cavity will carry into higher parts of the brain. When the brain receives the information sent from the olfactory system, it can access the amygdala and the hippocampus, which are responsible for triggering emotions and memory, respectively. If there are strong or positive memories associated with the sense or taste the brain processes, then the food will evoke stronger or more positive emotions in addition to the emotion the food would evoke on its own. Nostalgia can feel hard to describe because it triggers feelings rather than detailed thought. The olfactory receptor cells send pulses to the emotional center of the brain, but not the logical center, where we would process words or movement. In these two examples of how nostalgia from food can be portrayed, both really emphasize the strength of emotion that a particular food can bring. So a way that food can affect your body's mood and behavior indirectly is through the production of hormones and neurotransmitters during digestion. In the lining of the digestive tract are sensors called enterochromaffin cells, or EC cells, as you can see in the diagram here. The substances that trigger these cells are still being observed in current research, but it is known that when food passes through the bowels, the EC cells produce serotonin, which is the molecule here, also known as 5-HT. So once this 5-HT is produced, it is received by these 5-HT receptors and then sent to the rest of the body through neurons. While most people believe that majority of our serotonin is produced in the brain, more than 90% is actually produced in the digestive system. So after you start to eat something and your body's level of serotonin starts to increase, it will act as a mood stabilizer, which will make you feel calmer and help to relieve anxiety, which is why nostalgic memories from, say, a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies can help you to de-stress and make you feel better.
In this section, we're going to explore sound and music evoked nostalgia. Before we delve into how hearing is connected to nostalgia, let's first explore how we actually hear things. Sounds are created by the disruption and movement of surrounding air particles, which travel as a longitudinal wave through the air until it reaches your ear. But what exactly happens when that air wave reaches your ear? There are areas in the airwave where gas particles are very close to each other and create a higher pressure, while other areas where gas particles are not as close create lower pressures. And these constantly changing pressures are what makes our eardrums go in and out at the same rate. This is the cochlea, which is normally a spiral-looking part of the inner ear that produces nerve impulses from sound vibrations. Once the sound waves move the eardrum moves 3 small bones to hit the base of the cochlea. Inside the cochlea, a fluid moves with the rhythm caused by the bones, and the fluid's movement causes the basilar membrane in the ear, which is this gray strip or this black moving line, to vibrate at a certain section, depending on the original frequency of the sound wave. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch, and higher frequencies are detected at the base of the cochlea, while lower frequencies are detected at the apex. And there's something really interesting that has to do with ions in the cochlea. So imagine that you took a cross-section of the unrolled cochlea. These top and bottom sections are filled with a sodium ion-rich fluid called perilymph, while the middle section is filled with a potassium ion-rich fluid called the endolymph. The top of these hair cells right here, also known as stereocilia, are covered in the potassium ion endolymph, while the cell bodies right here are covered in the sodium ion perilymph. And the potential difference and the concentration differences of ions allow the potassium ions to flow from the endolymph into the stereocilia into the cell body, which then triggers neurotransmitters and sends nerve impulses down the various nerves over to the brain. And so why exactly do we grow so attached to certain songs, especially from our teenage years? When we first hear a song, it stimulates our auditory cortex, which converts rhythms, pitches, melodies, and harmonies into one. From there, our reaction to music depends on how our brain interacts with it. Sing with the song, you activate your premotor cortex. Pay attention to the lyrics, you activate your parietal cortex. Listen to a song and trigger personal memories, that activates the prefrontal cortex. This isn't a complete list of what your brain does, but just know that a lot and many parts of your brains are activated when listening to music. So during our angsty teenagehood, our neurons are rapidly developing and we are listening to songs on repeat. And combined with the way our brain highly activates with music, it ensures that we form and solidify connections between memories of adolescence and specific songs, which we can remember much later in life. A psychological reason for why we develop and feel music evokes nostalgia is, according to a 2009 study from the University of Leeds, adolescence and early adulthood is a period in our lives when we're developing our sense of self, and anything that contributes to that development of self, like music, will be remembered for a long time. There are so many biological and chemical factors that play into nostalgia, but at the end of the day, our lives become increasingly complex with more anxieties of adulthood. We lose sight of simpler times and what it means to be happy.
But to listen to that old song from when you were 13 or take in the scent of a sweet summer breeze sometimes keeps ourselves together and in touch with simpler times.